The page is faded now, the ink browned at the edges where humidity has worked on it for nearly 2 centuries. It is a ledger page, unremarkable in its dimensions, about the size of a sheet of writing paper, and it was kept by a Virginia planter named Cable Whitfield in the year 1840. His handwriting is neat, practiced, the handwriting of a man who attended to his accounts with care. The left-hand column reads, as you might expect from any farm in the antebellum South. Corn, 400 bushels, 50 cents per bushel equals $200. Rye, 80 bushels, 75 cents per bushel equals $60. Sweet potatoes, 120 bushels, 30 cents per bushel equals $36. Ordinary figures, the kind of record that fills 1,000 archive boxes across the old tobacco states. Then your eye moves to the right-hand column, and the page changes entirely. Clary, 1 child, girl, born March, estimated value at age 10, $400. Sally, 1 child, boy, born January, estimated value at age 12, $600. Phoebe, no issue this year. See note or age. In America, there was a time when a woman's womb was listed next to the corn harvest, when children had a dollar value assigned before they could walk, when the expected yield of a human being's body was calculated with the same pencil that calculated the expected yield of an acre of ground. This is not metaphor. This is not exaggeration offered for dramatic effect. This is accounting. This is the ordinary paperwork of an industry that operated in the open, discussed in polite company, defended in the halls of Congress, and financed by the most respectable banking institutions in the United States. Historians call it the domestic slave trade. Some call it the Second Middle Passage. The people who lived inside it called it being sold down the river, being sent to Georgia, being coffled south, phrases loaded with a specific terminal dread. The planters who ran it called it the natural increase of their labor force, the improvement of stock, the management of human property for maximum return. They wrote about it in letters to their neighbors, in agricultural journals, in speeches to state legislatures. They were not hiding. They were proud. They had found a solution to a supply problem, and the solution was making people. This is that story. It begins, as most American economic disasters begin, with a law that solved one problem while manufacturing another. On January 1, 1808, the act prohibiting importation of slaves took effect. Congress had passed it the previous March, one of the last actions of Thomas Jefferson's presidency. And on the surface, it represented a moral stand. The United States would no longer participate in the transatlantic slave trade. No more ships from Liverpool or Bristol or Nantes. No more human cargo from the Gold Coast or the Congo River Delta. The trade that had brought somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 enslaved Africans to North American shores over the preceding 2 centuries. A trade that had already made fortunes in New England as well as the South, in shipping, in insurance, in the manufacture of goods traded for captives, was now illegal. The abolitionists celebrated. The newspapers in the free states ran editorials. It was, by the standards of the time, a meaningful legislative achievement. It did not free a single enslaved person. It did not reduce demand for enslaved labor by so much as 1 field hand, 1 cook, 1 carpenter, 1 woman valued for her reproductive capacity. It did not slow the cotton gin, which Eli Whitney had patented in 1793, and which had, in the years since, transformed the American South into a cotton-producing machine of breathtaking and terrible efficiency. Before the cotton gin, cleaning a pound of cotton by hand took a laborer an entire day. After the gin, a single enslaved worker could clean 50 pounds a day. The gin did not reduce the need for people in the field. It multiplied it. Cotton production, which stood at roughly 73,000 bales in 1800, would reach 4.5 million bales by 1860. Every bale required hands to plant it, chop the weeds, pick the bolls, haul the harvest. The demand for those hands did not stop because the legal supply from Africa had been cut off. What stopped was the legal importation. What did not stop, what could not stop, because the economics were too powerful and the political will to truly end the institution was not there, was the demand itself. And so the system adapted, as systems do. This is the part American history classes skip. The textbook says, Congress banned the slave trade in 1808, period, end of paragraph. Next chapter, usually something about the War of 1812 or the Missouri Compromise. The sentence is accurate as far as it goes. But demand didn't stop. Cotton didn't stop. Sugar didn't stop. Louisiana's sugar parishes were consuming enslaved labor at catastrophic rates, working people to death in the cane fields and needing constant replacement. Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and eventually Texas were opening up for plantation agriculture, each new state a new engine of demand for human labor. So supply was manufactured domestically. The sentence that should follow in every American history textbook. And then, to meet the demand, the Upper South turned to systematically breeding enslaved people for sale, is the sentence nobody writes. It is the sentence that has been excised from the national story with such thoroughness that most Americans today would be genuinely shocked to learn it is true. It is true. It is documented. The records exist. They have always existed. In the years immediately following 1808, the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, North Carolina, was undergoing its own agricultural crisis that had nothing to do with the slave trade ban. Decades of tobacco cultivation had exhausted the soil. The great tidewater plantations that had made Virginia aristocrats wealthy in the 18th century were working land that no longer produced at the old levels. The tobacco economy was declining, but the planters still had their land, their houses, their social position, and they still had their enslaved people. And enslaved people, it turned out, were now worth considerably more than tobacco. Cabell Whitfield understood this before most of his neighbors did. He was 53 years old in 1808 and had inherited his plantation, 640 acres in Henrico County, Virginia, from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Whitfields had grown tobacco on this land, had grown prosperous enough to build the columned house that stood at the end of the cedar-lined drive, had cultivated the genteel manners and deliberate speech of the Virginia planter class. Whitfield was not a cruel man, in the way that his era understood cruelty. He did not beat his enslaved people casually or for pleasure. He fed them, he clothed them, he called in the doctor when they fell seriously ill, though called in meant something different when the person being examined was property, as we shall see. He attended his church on Sundays and considered himself a Christian. He was, by the social standards of antebellum Virginia, a respectable man. He had 63 enslaved people on his plantation in 1808. By 1840, he had 112. Not all of that increase was due to natural reproduction. Some of it was purchased, in the years when Whitfield still had capital to deploy. But a significant portion, the portion that Whitfield tracked in his ledger with the same careful attention he gave his corn yields, was what he called, in his correspondence and in his accounts, the natural growth of his labor force. The phrase appears frequently in his letters to his factor in Richmond. The natural growth of the force has been satisfactory this year. I expect the natural growth to continue if the women are properly managed. My neighbor Aldrich has had poor natural growth, and I believe he has been selling off his best breeders, a short-sighted policy in current market conditions. He never used the word breed directly. That was a gentleman's scruple. The word he preferred was increase. But the ledger knew what he meant. The ledger always knew. Clary was listed in that ledger for the first time in 1825, when she was brought to Whitfield's plantation from a smaller farm some miles to the east, purchased for $480. She was 16 years old. The sale record, which survives in the county deed books, describes her as one Negro girl named Clary, age 16 years, sound of limb and body, good teeth, no marks or defects visible. Sound, good teeth, no defects. The language of livestock, the language of a transaction in which the human being transferred had no legal standing, no right to object, no name that the law recognized as mattering beyond its utility as an identifier for the property in question. She had a name before the sale record. She had a mother who called her by it in a particular way, a way that nobody on Whitfield's plantation would ever reproduce because they had not known her in that place. She had, as she would later tell her daughter Siller in the years before everything changed, a way of waking up in the morning in the place she had been born that she could still feel in her body even after 15 years on Whitfield's land. The particular quality of the light, the smell of the woods, the sound of the creek. She did not speak of this often. Speaking of it cost something she could not afford to spend freely. By 1840, when Cable Whitfield made the ledger entry that opened this story, Clary was 31 years old and had borne 5 children. The first had been born when she was 18 and had died at 3 months. A mercy, Phoebe told her, though Clary had not been able to see it that way for a long time. The second, a boy named Amos, had been sold to a trader when he was 4 years old. She had held his face in her hands before they took him, pressing the shape of his cheeks into her palms, memorizing the small, particular weight of him. She did not know if she had succeeded. She was not sure memory worked that way. But she tried. The third child, a girl, had been sold at age 7 to a planter in Georgia, passing through the Alexandria market on her way south, and Clary had not been allowed to say goodbye. She had been in the tobacco drying shed when it happened, had come out to find the girl simply gone, her small blanket still folded on the pallet where she slept. The fourth child was still on the plantation, a boy of 8 named Thomas, named with a bitterness Clary kept below the surface, after the president who had written "All men are created equal," and who had also, according to his own farm book, calculated the annual financial yield of his enslaved women's reproductive capacity. She kept the name because she kept the boy, and keeping the boy was everything. The fifth child, the girl referenced in the ledger entry, Clary, 1 child, girl, born March. Estimated value at age 10, $400, had been born 6 weeks before Whitfield made that notation. She was named Siller, and she was very small, and she had not yet learned to smile deliberately, though sometimes her face arranged itself into something that approached a smile, and Clary watched those moments the way a person watches a lamp flame in a wind, with total attention, praying for it to last. Whitfield wrote $400 next to his daughter's name. He had calculated her future sale price before she could hold her own head up. This requires a pause, a deliberate, conscious pause in which we consider what it means that this calculation was made. Not by a monster, not by a man who was exceptional in his cruelty or his moral deformity, by a representative man of his class and region, doing what his father had done, what his neighbors did, what the agricultural journals recommended, what the law permitted, what the banks financed. A man who attended church and was kind to his dogs and wrote careful letters to his children at school in Richmond. A man who sat at his mahogany desk with a good pen in his hand and looked at a 6-week-old infant girl and wrote $400 in the column next to her mother's name. The horror is not in some act of individual wickedness. The horror is in the normalcy. The horror is that this was Tuesday. To understand how this normalcy was built and maintained, you need to understand the economic logic that underpinned it. And to understand that logic, you need to begin with the man who did more to establish it than perhaps anyone else in American history. The man whose shadow falls across every page of this ledger and every sale receipt, and every shipping manifest in this story. Thomas Jefferson had a farm book. It is a meticulous document, maintained over several decades, recording the lives and deaths and births and transactions of the people he enslaved at Monticello. It records their names, their ages, their work assignments, their clothing allotments, their corn rations. It records the births of their children, and in the margins and supporting documents that historians have analyzed for decades, it records something else: Jefferson's careful calculations of the financial value of what he called the increase. In a letter to George Washington, Jefferson wrote about the return on investment represented by enslaved people, noting that a woman who brings a child every 2 years is more profitable than the best man of the farm, because what she produces is an addition to the capital. He went on to calculate that the annual increase, the growth in the population of enslaved people through reproduction, represented approximately 4% per year on the investment. 4%. This was, by the standards of the era, a reliable and attractive return, comparable to or exceeding the return on agricultural land, on commercial ventures, on government bonds. Jefferson was not uniquely calculating in this. He was representative. He was the founding father who happened to write these thoughts down with his usual lucidity and precision, who had the education and the habit of systematic thought that turned what other planters understood intuitively into explicit financial analysis. He was doing what every planter who kept books was doing, calculating the yield of his human property, including the reproductive yield, including the compounding effect of a population of enslaved women in their childbearing years. He was just doing it more clearly, more explicitly, and with a better pen. He was also, at the same time, sleeping in a house that stood on a mountain he had named after an Italian word for Little Mountain, in a country he had helped found on the principle that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He wrote those words. He believed something by them, perhaps not what we need to believe by them, but something. And he also wrote, in his farm book, the birth dates of the children of Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was enslaved at Monticello. She was also the half-sister of Jefferson's deceased wife, Martha, the daughter of Martha's father, John Wales, and an enslaved woman named Betty Hemings. She was, by most historical accounts now accepted by mainstream scholarship, the mother of several of Jefferson's children. She was his property. She was at least 30 years his junior when the relationship began, and she had no legal power to consent or refuse. She is listed in the farm book with the same accounting notation as everyone else Jefferson owned, the same column format, the same indifferent precision. The founding document of the American Republic and the farm book of its author exist in the same universe. Americans have spent 2.5 centuries working to avoid looking at them simultaneously. But Phoebe looked at them simultaneously, every day, because that was the only universe available to her. Phoebe was Clary's mother. She was in her late 50s in 1840, which made her ancient by the standards of plantation labor, where the combination of overwork, malnutrition, and medical neglect compressed a human lifespan into something that bore little resemblance to the natural course. She had been on Whitfield's plantation for 40 years. She had, in that time, borne 11 children. 7 survived to adulthood. 4 were still on the plantation, Clary and 3 others. The remaining 3 who were alive were somewhere in the deep South, sold away in the years when Whitfield was converting his operation from tobacco agriculture to something that the ledger book reflected more honestly. She knew one had gone to Alabama. She knew one had gone to Louisiana. She had heard, through the network of whispered information that moved through enslaved communities with a swiftness that white Virginians never fully appreciated, that the one in Alabama had been put to work on a cotton plantation in the Tennessee River Valley. The one in Louisiana she had heard nothing about, and the silence where that knowledge should have been had the specific quality of grief that comes when you understand that the absence of information is itself a form of information. Phoebe counted her children the way a teller at a bank counts currency, methodically, starting over when she lost track, checking the count against itself. She counted them when she woke up. She counted them sometimes in the middle of work, pausing at the washtub or the garden row to run through the names and faces and last known locations. It was not, she understood, a useful exercise. Knowing their names did not help them. Knowing their faces did not bring them back. But forgetting was worse. Forgetting was the last thing the system could take from her, and she had decided, in the unspoken way that people decide the things that will keep them alive, that she would not let it. "You count," she told Clary once, when Clary was nursing the baby she would lose to the Georgia sale. "You count them so they don't become nothing. You count them so they was real. 11. 7 alive. 4 here." She had stopped expecting the ones who were gone to come back. That expectation, she had learned through years of its violation, was the cruelest luxury. But she had not stopped counting. She never stopped counting. The machinery that had produced Phoebe's arithmetic, the machinery that had turned 11 children into an accounting problem rather than a family, was running at full capacity by 1840, and it ran on a combination of law, economics, violence, and ideology that had been built up over decades to make the unthinkable not only thinkable, but ordinary. Here is how it worked. An enslaved woman's reproductive capacity was, in the legal framework of antebellum America, the property of her enslaver. Children born to enslaved women were enslaved from birth, regardless of who their father was, regardless of circumstances, regardless of anything except the legal status of the mother. This principle, known in Roman law as partus sequitur ventrum, the offspring follows the womb, had been codified in Virginia as early as 1662. Its practical effect was to make every enslaved woman's body a productive asset in the most literal sense. She produced not only labor, but capital. Every child she bore was additional inventory. This was not an incidental feature of the slave system. It was, particularly after 1808, its central economic engine. Slaveholders managed this engine with the same attention they gave to any other aspect of their operation. They selected enslaved men considered physically strong and healthy to father children with multiple women, sometimes on their own plantation, sometimes hired out to neighboring farms for the explicit purpose of reproduction. This hiring out was so common that it had an informal market price. An enslaved man of appropriate physical qualities could be hired for this purpose for a season at rates that varied by region and reputation. The man himself received nothing. His body was the product being rented. On Whitfield's plantation, this man was Wash. Wash was 32 years old in 1840, a blacksmith by training, large-framed and physically imposing in the way that was, in the calculus of the slave system, both an asset and a liability, useful for the forge, useful for the image of productive wealth that a planter wished to project, and also dangerous in the way that large, intelligent men are always considered dangerous by those who hold them in chains. He spoke carefully and infrequently. Silence, he had learned early, was a kind of armor. If you did not say what you thought, they could not use it against you. If you did not show what you felt, they could not take it. He had been hired out to 2 other plantations in the 2 years before 1840 for purposes that the hiring contracts described in the language Whitfield and his neighbors used for everything: general labor and management of the forge. The forge was real. Wash was a skilled blacksmith, and the neighbors' farms had work that needed doing: hinges, tools, the metal fittings for the machinery of agricultural production. But there were other reasons a planter hired a man like Wash, and those reasons were written into the ledgers of the other plantations, in the same column where Clary's daughter's estimated sale price appeared. Children on those farms who were born in the seasons following Wash's visits were noted in the records. Their fathers were not named. The accounting did not require it. Wash knew. He had known for years. He carried the knowledge the way you carry an injury that has healed wrong. Always there. Sometimes barely noticeable. Sometimes blinding. He had children on those other farms. He had never seen them. He did not know their names. He had no legal standing to know their names, no right to seek them out, no recourse whatsoever. The law was absolutely clear on this point. He was not their father in any sense the law recognized. He was equipment that had been used. His relationship with Clary had begun 3 years earlier, and it was complicated in the specific, agonizing way that everything in this system was complicated, which is to say, it was real, and it was also arranged. Whitfield had not explicitly ordered them to be together, but he had managed the conditions that made it likely, housing them near each other, ensuring Wash was on the plantation rather than hired out during the relevant season, making it clear through the invisible but unmistakable pressure of the system that this pairing was desired. Clary and Wash both understood this. They had never directly named it to each other, but the understanding lived in the room with them, in the space between what was said and what was known. What was also real was that Wash was the only person on Whitfield's plantation who talked to Clary the way the dead did, by which she meant the way the dead would have talked to her if they could, which was with the knowledge that some things cannot be fixed and some truths cannot be made bearable, and that a person can hold these things and still be standing tomorrow. He did not offer comfort. He did not pretend the situation was other than what it was. He sat with her in the truth of it, which was more valuable than comfort, because comfort was something Whitfield could also offer, and Whitfield's version of it cost a price she could not afford. Another one, Clary said to Wash on an evening in March of 1840, 6 weeks after Siller was born, when Whitfield had walked through the quarters and looked at the baby, with the particular assessing look she had learned to recognize, not admiration, estimation. Yes, Wash said. He wrote something down. He always writes something down. She's 6 weeks. Wash said nothing. There was nothing to say that was not the truth, and the truth was that 6 weeks was old enough to be listed in the column. 6 weeks was old enough to begin acquiring value. 6 weeks, in the accounting of Whitfield's plantation, was not a beginning. It was a stage in a process that had begun before Siller was born, that had begun, in fact, when Whitfield calculated that Clary's reproductive history and physical soundness made her worth the $480 he had paid for her 16 years ago. Dr. Clement Farrow arrived at Whitfield's plantation 4 times a year, as regular as the seasons, and his visits served multiple purposes. He attended to genuine medical needs, the injuries and illnesses that plantation labor produced in abundance, the fevers that moved through quarters with terrible efficiency, the injuries from the forge and the field that required something beyond the folk remedies and whispered healing knowledge that passed among the enslaved women. He set bones. He dosed for parasites. He applied poultices to infected cuts that, in the days before antiseptic medicine, could kill a person in a week if untreated. He also examined the enslaved women of childbearing age for what his professional notes called soundness of the reproductive function. Dr. Farrow had been practicing medicine in Henrico County for 25 years. He had written 2 papers for the Virginia Medical and Surgical Journal on what he called the management of Negro health on agricultural estates, papers that drew on his observations at 7 plantations in the county, and that discussed, in the calm clinical language of mid-19th century medicine, the relationship between nutrition, workload, and reproductive output in enslaved women. The papers were well received. His colleagues considered him a careful observer and a man of scientific temperament. He believed this about himself. He was not wrong that he was careful and systematic. He was wrong about what those qualities were in the service of. His examination of the enslaved women at Whitfield's plantation followed a protocol he had refined over years. He checked teeth, a reliable indicator of overall health, he noted in his papers, and also of age, since the deceptive practice of misrepresenting an enslaved person's age in sale transactions was common enough to warrant mention in the professional literature. He checked hands for the callus patterns that indicated what kind of work a person had been doing and at what intensity. He checked eyes for the yellowish tinge that indicated liver disease. He checked the abdomen, the chest. He asked questions, delivered in the clipped professional tone of a man accustomed to patients who had no choice but to answer, about menstrual regularity, about the number and outcomes of previous pregnancies, about current physical complaints. Clary had been examined by Dr. Farrow 9 times since coming to Whitfield's plantation. She knew exactly what he was looking for. She knew because Phoebe had told her, and Phoebe had known because the woman before her had told her, and back, the knowledge moving through the generations of enslaved women, like water through rock, patient, persistent, finding every crack. What he was looking for, in the language of the ledger, was continued viability as a reproductive asset. What he found, on the examination he conducted in late April of 1840, when Siller was 2 months old, was that Clary was, in his professional notation, sound in all particulars, recovering well from last confinement, likely for continued increase. He wrote this in the examination record he maintained for Whitfield, which was organized not by the format of a medical record, but by the format of an inventory. Name, age, physical condition, estimated productive life remaining. He charged Whitfield $2 per examination. He examined 14 women in the course of his quarterly visit. His invoice, which also survives in the county records, notes the examinations under the heading, Examination of Breeding Stock, $28. The medicalization of the system, the way that science and professional expertise were mobilized to describe, rationalize, and optimize it, was not incidental to the enterprise. It was necessary. It transformed the buying and selling of human beings from a moral question into a technical one. It gave the language of objectivity and expertise to practices that would otherwise have been immediately recognizable as what they were. A farmer who said, "I think this woman is healthy enough to keep having children," was saying something that even people in 1840 might have found uncomfortable. A doctor who wrote, "Sound in all particulars, likely for continued increase," was making a scientific observation. The difference in language was the difference between guilt and respectability. Dr. Farrow wrote papers in agricultural journals. The agricultural journals were read by planters who were also reading articles on cattle breeding, on horse selection, on the improvement of livestock through careful management of reproduction. The parallel was not accidental. It was deliberate. The ideology that justified what happened on Whitfield's plantation, and on hundreds of plantations like it across the Upper South, required exactly this kind of parallel, because it required the dehumanization of the people being bred to be legible in the language of the culture that was doing it. And the culture that was doing it was a culture of farmers. The language it reached for, when it needed to describe what it was doing without calling it what it was the language of husbandry. The practice of offering incentives to enslaved women who bore children, lighter workloads during pregnancy, extra food allocations, small privileges, was widespread enough to be discussed in agricultural manuals. One such manual, published in 1837 and circulated widely in Virginia and Maryland, recommended that planters take care to reward the women who bring children regularly, both to protect the investment during the period of confinement and to encourage the natural increase of the labor force. The word reward appeared frequently in this literature. It described things like being excused from field work during the final months of pregnancy, being allowed to nurse a child for a longer period before returning to full labor, being given a slightly larger corn ration, being housed in a slightly warmer building. These were not gifts. They were management strategies, and they were experienced by the women receiving them not as kindness, but as something considerably more complicated, because every small mercy in the slave system arrived with the implicit message that it could be withdrawn, and that its withdrawal was always available as a tool of control. The woman who had been given a lighter workload during pregnancy knew that the lighter workload was contingent on her continued performance of the function that had earned it. She knew that the extra food could become less food. She knew that the warmer housing could become the cold quarters. The privileges were a form of bondage as surely as the chains, because they created a structure of incentive and threat around the most intimate and involuntary processes of her body. Some planters promised freedom. There are records of slaveholders who told enslaved women that they would be manumitted after bearing a certain number of children: 8, 10, 12. The promises were rarely kept. They were rarely intended to be kept. They were intended to be believed, which is a different thing. Phoebe had been promised freedom when she turned 45. She was 58. The promise had never been mentioned again after it was made. Whitfield, if asked, would probably have said that circumstances had changed, that the economics of the operation required him to retain experienced members of his labor force, that he would of course honor the promise when conditions permitted. He might even have believed it. The self-deception of people who do terrible things for ordinary reasons is very deep. "He'll promise Siller the same thing," Phoebe told Clary one evening, sorting dried beans in the lamplight, her hands moving with the automatic precision of long practice. "When she's old enough to hear it. He'll promise her, and you'll want her to believe it because believing it will help her, and you'll know it's a lie. Mama, I'm telling you so you're ready, not so you'll stop her from believing it. She'll need to believe something. Just make sure she also knows." Phoebe's hands kept moving. "Make sure she knows the count." The count. Phoebe's word for the knowledge that the system counted you, counted your children, counted your worth, counted your remaining productive years, and that the only response available was to count back, to know the number, to keep the inventory of your own humanity in your own mind, because nobody else was going to keep it for you. Clary had the count. She had been keeping it since the first child was sold. By 1840, it went like this: 4 children sold or gone, 1 still here, 1 new, mother still here, wash still here, 17 people in the quarters she knew by name, 3 of them pregnant, 2 of them elderly and therefore at risk of sale when they could no longer work, 1 young man who had been talking in ways that frightened her, because they were the right ways, but the dangerous ways, and somewhere south of here, somewhere in the great dark mouth of the Deep South trade, children with her face who did not know her name. She kept the count. It was the only thing she owned that nobody could take away. They could take everything else, and they had, and they would again, but they could not go inside her head and remove what she kept there. The man who would come to take more of it arrived in September of 1840. His name was Josias Peck, and he was 41 years old, and he had been in the slave-trading business since he was 23, when he had taken a position as an agent for a firm out of Richmond. He was now employed by a company modeled closely on the most successful operation in the trade, the firm of Franklin and Armfield, based in Alexandria, which had, over the preceding 2 decades, become the largest slave-trading enterprise in American history. Isaac Franklin and John Armfield had built their operation in the 1820s, establishing their main depot at 1315 Duke Street in Alexandria, Virginia, a facility that had holding pens, office buildings, and the full apparatus of a commercial shipping operation. They sent enslaved people south by sea, loading them onto ships. The brig Tribune was one of the vessels they regularly used, from the wharves of Alexandria and Baltimore, shipping them to Natchez and New Orleans, and the ports that fed the cotton and sugar parishes. They also sent people overland in coffles, long chains of enslaved men, women, and children, handcuffed or neck-collared to one another, marched on foot through the Virginia countryside and down through Tennessee and Mississippi to the markets of Natchez and New Orleans. A coffle might consist of 40, 60, 100 people. They walked 15 to 20 miles a day. They were given minimal food. They slept on the ground. When they reached their destination, they were cleaned up and dressed in fresh clothes for presentation at market. Franklin and Armfield were not particularly unusual in what they did. They were unusual in how well they did it, in the scale they achieved, in the organizational sophistication they brought to an industry that had previously been more scattered and improvised. They had regular shipping schedules. They had agents throughout the Upper South, like Josias Peck, who sourced product from plantations and estates, purchasing directly from planters who needed cash, buying from the estates of deceased slaveholders, attending court days and estate sales where enslaved people were sold to pay debts. They had a grading system, prime field hands, likely women, fancy, the last a specific and horrifying sub-market that we will address in its proper place. By the time they retired, Franklin in the mid-1830s, Armfield somewhat later, they had made fortunes. Franklin went to a Tennessee plantation, Fairview, where he lived as a country gentleman. Armfield returned to North Carolina, became a philanthropist, and gave money to build a school. Their slave pen at 1315 Duke Street in Alexandria still stands. It is now the Freedom House Museum. It is the kind of irony that history produces when it is not yet done with a place. Josias Peck carried a small leather notebook in the breast pocket of his coat. He had started carrying it when he began in the trade, and he had filled 37 of them over his career, each one identical, a small commercial ledger with a brown cover, the pages gridded in blue lines. He recorded everything: names, ages, physical descriptions, prices paid, prices asked, the name of the seller, the name of the buyer, the date of the transaction, the destination. He noted special characteristics, a skill, a language ability, a medical history, because these affected price, positively or negatively. He noted what he called temperament, by which he meant the degree of visible resistance a person showed, because buyers wanted to know, and because a person who showed too much resistance might affect the others on a coffle. He was not a cruel man in any theatrical sense. He did not beat people for sport. He was professional in his manner with the planters who were his sellers and the buyers who were his customers. Courteous, efficient, knowledgeable about current market prices in Natchez and New Orleans, capable of discussing the grading standards with the precision of a commodities broker. He was, in the language of his time, a very good businessman. He arrived at Whitfield's plantation on a Tuesday morning in September, tied his horse at the post near the main house, and was shown inside for a glass of cider and a discussion with Whitfield that lasted the better part of an hour. Their conversation covered prices. Peck gave Whitfield the current New Orleans auction rates for prime field hands, $1,100 to $1,400 for likely women of proven fertility, $1,200 to $1,500 for children of various ages. And Whitfield listened with the attentive expression of a man calculating something in his head throughout. "I have several I'm willing to consider," Whitfield said, which was the language both men preferred to the more direct alternatives. 3 men, 2 women, and possibly some younger ones. Peck's notebook came out. Ages? They went through the list together. Whitfield had prepared it. He was a careful man. In the quarters, the news moved before Peck ever appeared. This was always how it happened. The information traveling through the invisible channels of the enslaved community with a speed that was entirely at odds with the white assumption that enslaved people were passive and incurious. Someone had seen the horse. Someone had recognized the saddle markings as belonging to a trader's mount. Someone had seen Whitfield's face in the morning, before the meeting. wearing the expression he wore when he had been calculating. Clary heard it from a woman named Dina, who heard it from the boy who worked in the stable, who had not heard it from anyone but had simply known, with the survival instinct that children in this system developed early, what the strange horse meant. "Trader," Dina said, passing by the garden where Clary was working, not stopping, not looking up. The word dropped as quietly as a stone into water. Clary looked up at the main house. The distance between her and it was perhaps 100 yards. She could see the windows. She could not see what was happening inside them. She looked at Siller, 6 months old now, sleeping in a cloth sling tied to the post at the garden's edge. She began to count. Peck's examination of the people Whitfield was willing to sell took place the following morning, in the yard behind the main house, in a scene that repeated itself with minor variations on hundreds of plantations across the Upper South, every season of every year. The enslaved people were brought out one at a time and presented to Peck, who conducted his examination with the systematic efficiency of a man who had done this 10,000 times and knew exactly what he was looking for and how to find it. He checked teeth. He checked hands. He asked people to walk, to lift their arms, to turn around. He asked about their histories, their skills, their work, their families, not out of any interest in their humanity, but because the answers affected price. A skilled carpenter was worth more than an unskilled field hand. A woman who had borne children was worth more than a woman who had not. A man with a history of resistance or escape attempts was worth less, perhaps much less, and needed to be moved carefully. Dr. Farrow was not present for this examination, though his records were. Whitfield had pulled the relevant pages from his health records, Farrow's quarterly examinations, laid out in their clinical columns, and showed them to Peck as supporting documentation. A planter presenting Farrow's certification of soundness could ask more for the people being sold. It was, in the commercial language of the trade, a warranty. Among the people Peck examined that morning was Siller. She was 14 years old by the time the examination happened. Not the infant of 1840, but a girl who had grown up in the quarters, who had learned to read a little from a woman named Abby, who had once been a house servant in a Richmond family, and who passed on the dangerous gift of letters with the same quiet urgency that Phoebe passed on the Count. Siller was thin, with her mother's eyes and her mother's quality of attention, that focused, precise awareness of everything around her that was the survival trait the system had selected for over generations, the trait that looked like intelligence because it was intelligence, the kind that grows from the need to read every room, every face, every shift in the air for the signal that something was about to change. Peck looked at her for perhaps 2 minutes. He noted her age, her build, her teeth. He noted, in the professional shorthand of the trade, that she was likely, a specific term with a specific meaning in the slave market, indicating that a young woman was considered physically developed enough to be valued, not just for current labor, but for future reproductive capacity. Likely was a price category. Likely meant she would sell well in New Orleans. He wrote this in his notebook. He wrote her name, her age, her build, and the word likely, and next to that, a figure, $550. Siller was standing 10 feet away when he wrote this. She could not see what he wrote, but she had been in the slave quarters long enough, had listened to Clary long enough, had absorbed enough of Phoebe's instruction in the education of survival to understand what the examination meant and approximately what the notation would say. She was trying, at that moment, to memorize her mother's voice, not her mother's face. She would always have the face, she thought. Faces were easy, but voices changed in memory, became thin and distant, lost the specific timbre that made them distinct from all other voices. She was trying to hear her mother's voice in her memory while it was still fresh, trying to burn it in deeply enough that it would last. She did not cry. Crying was the thing you did later, privately, after you had done all the things that needed doing first. This was something Clary had taught her, without ever using those exact words. Simply by example. Simply by being a woman who did the thing that needed doing and cried somewhere else, somewhere private, where the crying couldn't be seen and used. Peck's notebook entry for the September 1840 visit to Whitfield's plantation listed 6 names, 6 ages, 6 prices. 3 of them were sold, including Siller. The other 3 Whitfield decided to hold. Market prices in New Orleans had dipped slightly in the previous quarter, and Whitfield calculated that waiting until spring, when prices typically rose, would yield him better returns. The sale of Siller was finalized the following morning. The document, a standard printed form with blanks filled in by Whitfield's hand, reads, "Received of Josias Peck, agent, the sum of $560, being in full payment for a Negro girl named Siller, age 14 years, sound of limb and body, warranted a slave for life." The warranty was important. It meant Whitfield guaranteed she was legally enslaved, would remain so, and was physically as represented. It was the language of a bill of sale for livestock, adapted for human beings so completely that the adaptation was no longer visible to the people using it. $560, a dollar more than Peck had initially noted in his ledger. He had found some small defect in his first estimate, apparently, or had negotiated slightly upward on Whitfield's behalf. The extra dollar is noted in Whitfield's ledger. He was careful with his accounts. The morning they came for Siller began before sunrise. Clary had been awake all night. She had known since the sale was finalized, and she had known the moment it was finalized, before anyone told her, because she could read Whitfield's plantation the way you read weather, by pattern and precedent, and the particular quality of certain silences. She had been awake because sleeping would have required closing her eyes, and she was not willing to do that. She sat in the doorway of the quarters where they slept, Siller's warm weight beside her, and she looked at the sky above the fields, and she counted. She counted everything she knew about Siller, the sound of her breathing, the way she held her left shoulder slightly higher than her right when she was tired, the particular shade of her skin in morning light, which was different from afternoon light, which was different from the light of fire at night, the calluses on her right hand from the work she did, the way she moved when she thought nobody was watching, with a loose, private freedom that tightened the moment she became aware of being observed, because that tightening was itself a survival skill, the skill of making yourself smaller and less visible and less threatening in the presence of people with power over you. She counted these things. She put them in the place where she kept the others, Amos's face, the Georgia girl's weight in her arms, the sound Thomas made when he laughed, which was a bright and slightly too loud sound that Clary loved and was also afraid of because it was the sound of a child who had not yet learned to make himself small. Peck arrived at dawn with 2 other men, both of them employed by the same firm, both of them wearing the dusty, practical clothing of men who spent most of their time moving in the open air. One of them was leading a line of people, 12 people, linked by a chain that ran through iron handcuffs, who were the other portion of the coffle being assembled from several plantations in the area. They had been walking since the previous day. They looked at the ground. Siller stood in the yard. She had dressed herself carefully. This was Phoebe's instruction. When they come for you, dress yourself properly, because the way you carry yourself when they take you is the only thing they can't take away. She had on her good dress, the one she kept for Sundays, and her hair was neat. She was standing straight. Clary stood 5 feet away. She was not permitted to approach. One of Peck's men had positioned himself between them, not aggressively, not with his hand on any weapon, simply as a physical fact, a body between 2 bodies, which was enough. Clary did not say the things she had planned to say. Language, in that moment, was not the right instrument. The right instrument was her face, the totality of her attention, The act of looking at her daughter with everything she had, with all of the count, with the names and the faces and the weight in her arms, and Phoebe's 11 children and the great undifferentiated grief of the quarters that had been accumulating since before she was born. She looked. Siller looked back. Her shoulder was perfectly level. She was not making herself small. And then Peck's man took Siller's arm, gently, in the professional way of a man who understood that visible brutality at this stage of the process was bad for business, and she was walked to the chain, and the handcuffs went on, and the coffle began to move down the road toward the east, where it would eventually join the main road south, toward Petersburg, toward Danville, toward the Long March or the ship and the New Orleans market, and the particular hell of what waited at the end. Clary watched until she couldn't see them anymore. Then she went back to work. She had corn to bring in, Thomas to watch, Siller to count, 14 years old, sound and likely, $560. She would count it for the rest of her life. The coffle that Siller joined on that September morning in 1840 was one of hundreds that moved through Virginia and Maryland and Kentucky in those years, threading south like a slow, dark river through the American landscape. The people in those coffles, chained to one another, marching 15 to 20 miles a day, sleeping in the open or in temporary pens at the edges of towns, were not an aberration. They were not the product of individual cruelty or exceptional circumstance. They were the supply chain of the American cotton economy, moving from the exhausted tobacco land of the Upper South to the explosive, voracious demand of the Deep South cotton belt. Historians have given this movement a name, the Second Middle Passage. It is a deliberate echo and a deliberate accusation. The first Middle Passage was the transatlantic slave trade. The ships from Liverpool and Bristol and Nantes, the holds packed with human beings taken from the coasts of West and Central Africa. The crossing that killed somewhere between 10% and 20% of everyone who endured it, the trade that the 1808 ban was supposed to end. The second Middle Passage was the domestic trade that replaced it. The coffles, the ships from Alexandria and Baltimore to New Orleans, the movement of approximately 1 million enslaved people from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1790 and 1860. 1 million people. Approximately twice the number of enslaved Africans brought to North America during the entire history of the transatlantic slave trade. This is the number that tends to stop people. It stops them because it sounds like an exaggeration, and it is not. It is a conservative estimate derived from a combination of census data, shipping records, and sale documents. Historians Edward Baptist, Walter Johnson, Stephen Deal, and others have spent careers building the evidentiary case for this figure, examining the records that exist in archives across the South. And those records are extensive. The slave trade was a business, and business kept records. The records show the people. The records show the numbers. 1 million people moved from one part of the country to another, not by choice, not by migration, but by sale and transport over a period of 70 years. Most Americans have never heard the term Second Middle Passage. It is not in most textbooks. It does not appear in most curricula. It is not part of the national story that gets told about the antebellum period, which tends to focus on the political debates. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, in a way that keeps the actual human beings in the background, keeps them as context rather than subject, keeps the number 1 million as an abstraction rather than as what it actually was. 1 million individual departures, 1 million handcuff closings, 1 million moments in which a person looked back at the last thing they would ever see of the place they had known. Siller was one of them, and she was one of them in 1840, which was not the beginning. It was the middle. There were already 3 decades of this behind her, and there would be 2 more decades ahead. The ship that Peck used for the sea route, the overland coffle, was for shorter distances or when the shipping schedule did not align, was modeled exactly on the vessels Franklin and Armfield had used in their operation's prime years. Their ship, the Tribune, had made regular runs from Alexandria to New Orleans, carrying human beings in conditions that the manifests described with the same bland efficiency as a cargo of cotton bales or hogsheads of tobacco. Manifest of Negroes taken on board the brig Tribune, Isaac Franklin Master, Alexandria, Virginia, November 1st, 1834. The manifest listed names, ages, sexes, and physical descriptions. It did not list where anyone had come from. It did not list what anyone had left behind. A manifest from a similar voyage in November 1840, preserved in the records of the New Orleans Custom House, lists 83 people shipped from Alexandria to New Orleans. The manifest is a standard form, the blanks filled in by a clerk's hand. Names, ages, heights. The ages range from 3 years to 51. There is a column for marks and scars. There is a column for occupation. Most of the occupations are listed as field. Some are house. One is blacksmith. The manifest does not record what anyone thought or felt or remembered. It records what could be monetized. 3 years old. There is a 3-year-old on that manifest. Her name is listed as Harriet. Her height is given as 36 inches. Her occupation is listed as none. Her sale price, recorded separately in the New Orleans auction records that correspond to this shipment, was $120. $120. 3 years old. 36 inches. Harriet. These are the numbers that hit like punches. Not the large numbers. The billions. The millions. The centuries. The small ones. The specific ones. The ones with names. The New Orleans slave market was the largest in the country, and it was a functioning commercial exchange in every sense that phrase implies. It had established auction houses, regular trading schedules, standardized grading systems, competing firms, price publications, credit facilities, and the full apparatus of a mature market in a commodity for which demand was strong and growing. Walter Johnson, in his study of the market, described it as a place where the trade in human beings had been rationalized, systematized, and made as efficient as the trade in cotton or sugar. He was not exaggerating. The auction houses on Magazine Street and Baronne Street and in the St. Charles and St. Louis hotels conducted sales that drew buyers from across the Deep South, planters from the Mississippi Delta, factors from the Red River parishes, agents representing cotton interests in Alabama and Georgia and Texas. The people being sold were presented on a low wooden platform, the auction block, a physical object, a few feet of wood with steps up from the ground, and examined by prospective buyers before and during the auction. The examination was thorough in the way that Dr. Farrow's examinations were thorough. Teeth, hands, eyes, movement. Buyers were looking for soundness. Buyers were looking for value. For women, buyers were also looking for what the trade called proven fertility. A woman who had already borne children was worth more than a woman who had not, because she had demonstrated the reproductive capacity that was a primary component of her value. If her children could be produced as evidence at the sale, her price went up. The children were not always present. Sometimes they had already been sold separately to different buyers, which was one of the mechanisms by which the system produced the mass family separations that were its most visible and most devastating human consequence. There was also the fancy trade, and it requires direct address rather than euphemism. The fancy trade was the sale of light-skinned women and girls, predominantly the daughters and granddaughters of enslaved women and the white men who had assaulted them, conceived in the context of a system that gave white men absolute power over the bodies of the women they enslaved, for the explicit purpose of sexual exploitation. New Orleans was the center of this sub-market. The buyers were wealthy white men, and the prices were the highest in the slave trade: $1,500, $2,000, $3,000 for a woman or girl considered sufficiently light-skinned and physically appealing. These women and girls were not bought for field labor or domestic service, though they were sometimes assigned those roles as cover. They were bought for sexual slavery. This is not a matter of speculation or historical inference. It is documented in sale records, in the correspondence of buyers and sellers, in the accounts of abolitionists who observed the market, and most devastatingly in the first-hand accounts of the women who survived it, and, in some cases, were later able to tell their stories. Harriet Jacobs was one. In her 1861 narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Jacobs described the specific form of exploitation that the slave system made available to white men with wealth. The purchase of enslaved women and girls for sexual purposes, the systematic assault that was protected by law, the impossibility of legal recourse, the way that the threat of sale to New Orleans, to the fancy trade, to the worst end of the market, was used as a tool of control over enslaved women throughout the South. I knew what I must do, and with shame and sorrow I did it, Jacobs wrote, describing her attempt to protect herself from her enslaver by entering into a relationship with another white man who could offer some degree of protection. She understood that in a system where she had no legal rights, the only tools available were the ones the system had not thought to take away: intelligence, planning, the ability to navigate the desires and vulnerabilities of the men who held power over her. Her book was published in 1861. It was largely disbelieved by many white readers in the North, who found it difficult to credit that the system operated as she described. She had anticipated this. She wrote her narrative with meticulous care, knowing that its audience would be skeptical, knowing that the defense of slavery required not only the physical suppression of enslaved people, but the suppression of their testimony about what the system actually was. The slave system's ideological defenders had spent decades arguing that enslaved people were content, that the system was paternalistic and benign, that the accounts of abolitionist observers were exaggerated or invented. Against this machinery of denial, Jacobs set her own voice, her own evidence, her own account. It was not enough in 1861 to end what she was describing, but it was enough to ensure that the description survived. The WPA Federal Writers Project, conducted between 1936 and 1938 by the Roosevelt administration, sent interviewers across the South to speak with men and women who had been enslaved before emancipation and who were still alive. By then, in their 80s and 90s, and in some cases over 100 years old, over 2,300 of these interviews were conducted. They are the largest collection of first-hand accounts of slavery in American history. They are held in the Library of Congress. They are available to anyone. They describe, in the voices of the people who lived it, what happened on the plantations and in the auction houses and on the coffles. A woman from Virginia, interviewed in 1937, who was in her 90s and remembered with absolute clarity, said this: "My mother had 13 children, and 9 of us was sold away. She used to say she didn't know which hurt worse, the ones that died or the ones that got sold, because at least you knew where the dead ones was." A man from South Carolina, interviewed in 1936, who had been enslaved on a rice plantation, described the breeding practices at length. "They'd pick out who was going to be with who. The man didn't have no say, and the woman didn't have no say. The master had the say, and that was all there was to it. I had a sister that had 6 children, and didn't none of them have the same daddy, because master kept changing who she was with." A woman from Mississippi, interviewed in 1937, who had been born in Virginia and sold south as a child, described the coffle. "They chained us up and we walked for weeks. People fell down and they made them get up. One old woman fell down and couldn't get up and they just left her there. I don't know what became of her. I was 7 years old." 7 years old. These interviews were conducted nearly a century after the events they describe. They were conducted by interviewers who were often white, in a social context in which the full weight of Jim Crow segregation was still in force, in which formerly enslaved people and their descendants had every reason to be cautious about what they said to white strangers with notebooks. The interviews were conducted, in other words, in conditions that suppressed the testimony rather than amplified it. And the testimony is still there, in abundance, describing with specific, granular, unflinching precision what the system was. The records exist. They have always existed. Back on Whitfield's plantation, after Siller was gone, the work continued. It always continued. That was one of the structural features of the system, that the labor that sustained it did not pause for grief, that the corn still needed to come in, the forge still needed the fire, the ledger still needed the entries that justified everything. Clary worked. She worked because not working was not a choice that was available to her, and because working was one of the things that kept her from disappearing into the grief, and because Thomas was still there, and Thomas required her to be present and functional, which was also a grief, and also a reason. Wash came to her in the evenings sometimes. He did not speak much. He had never spoken much. But his presence had the quality of a fact that was true regardless of circumstances, which was a rarer and more valuable thing than most declarations. "They'll take her down the river," Clary said one night. It was not a question. "Yes," Wash said. "New Orleans. Most likely." She had never been to New Orleans. She knew it from description, from the accounts of people who had passed through it, people who had been there and come back, or whose stories had come back without them. She knew it was vast and dense and full of the commerce of human beings in a way that made Virginia look modest by comparison. She knew that people went to New Orleans and disappeared into the great machinery of the cotton economy, went south and west into the interior of the sugar parishes and the cotton plantations of Mississippi and Alabama, went so far away that the distance between them and everyone they had known became unbridgeable, not only by choice, but by geography, by the simple fact of miles without means. "She'll land somewhere, and she'll work," Clary said. "She'll be all right." Wash looked at her. "She'll be all right," Clary said again. He didn't answer. He was not in the habit of agreeing to things that were not true, but he was also not in the habit of saying so directly. He sat with her in the truth that neither of them could make better, that Siller would land somewhere and work, and that was the best they could hope for, and they both knew that was not all right, and that all right was a word that required a different universe to mean what they needed it to mean. She remembered the Count, Phoebe said from across the room, where she was sitting in the dark. They had not known she was awake. She was often awake when they thought she was sleeping. "I made sure she had it." Clary looked at her mother. Phoebe's face, in the firelight, was the face of a woman who had been in this room, in this system, in this grief for 40 years. It was not defeated. That was the thing that Clary had spent her life understanding and failing to fully understand. That her mother was not defeated. She was worn. She was old in a way that had nothing to do with years. She was carrying something that no person should have to carry. But she was not defeated. She was counting. "What do you count when there's nobody left to count?" Clary asked. It was not a question she had asked before. It came out of a place she had not been willing to look at until tonight. Phoebe was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You count the ones that were here. You count how they were. You count what they knew when they left. You keep the record, because somebody has to keep the record. And if you don't keep it, nobody will." The record. Cable Whitfield kept his records too. He was a careful man. By 1845, the ledger that had opened this story had been joined by several more. The plantation was running at a scale that required more documentation, more columns, more calculations. His income from slave sales had, by 1845, exceeded his income from agricultural production. He had made the transition that the most economically astute Upper South planters had made. He was no longer primarily a tobacco farmer who happened to own enslaved people. He was primarily a breeder and supplier of enslaved people who also happened to farm some tobacco. The land was a platform for the human inventory. The corn and rye in the ledger were supporting characters in a story whose main character was the right-hand column. This was not unusual. It was, by the 1840s, the dominant economic model for large planters throughout Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky. Historians estimate that Virginia alone exported more than 300,000 enslaved people to the Deep South between 1790 and 1860. 300,000 people, more than the population of many American cities of the period. 300,000 people who were, in the logic of the Virginia planter economy, the primary cash crop of the state. The soil that had been too tired for tobacco was not too tired for this. Let us now step back from the individual stories, from Clary's count, from Siller's coffle, from Phoebe's arithmetic of grief, and look at the full structure of what was happening in the American economy during these years. Because the story of slave breeding is not only a story of individual suffering, though it is that. It is also, and equally, a story about money, about capital, about the financial architecture of the United States in the decades before the Civil War, and about the way that financial architecture shapes everything that comes after it. By 1860, the market value of enslaved people in the United States was approximately $3.5 billion. That figure requires context to be understood. In 1860, the total value of all American railroads was approximately $1.1 billion. The total value of all American factories was approximately $1 billion. The total value of all American banks was approximately $700 million. Add them together, railroads, factories, banks, and you arrive at approximately $2.8 billion. The market value of enslaved people, of human beings bought, sold, bred, leveraged as collateral, insured, and traded on the markets of New Orleans and Natchez and Richmond, exceeded the combined value of every railroad, every factory, and every bank in the United States. Enslaved people were not a sideshow to the American economy in the years before the Civil War. They were the American economy. They were its largest asset class, its primary form of capital accumulation, the foundation on which the financial superstructure of the world's fastest-growing economy was built. Thomas Jefferson, calculating his 4% annual return on the increase of his enslaved women's reproduction, was not doing household accounting. He was doing what every major investor in the United States was doing, calculating the yield on the most productive asset class in the market. The planters who tracked births in their ledgers, the banks that accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans, the insurance companies that issued policies on enslaved lives, they were all operating in the same market, the same capital system, doing what capitalism does, finding the most efficient mechanism for accumulating surplus value and building it into the structure of wealth. The banks that financed the slave trade and accepted enslaved people as collateral, some of them are still operating under different names. The insurance companies that issued policies on enslaved lives, some of them are still operating. The wealth that flowed from the sale of 300,000 Virginia-born enslaved people into Deep South cotton production, that flowed from the $3.5 billion in human capital into the financial system of the antebellum period, did not disappear at Appomattox. Wealth does not disappear. It transforms. It converts into other assets, flows into other channels, becomes land, becomes industrial capital, becomes institutional endowments, becomes the particular shape of an economy that was built on one foundation and has been operating on that foundation ever since. There is a direct line from the right-hand column of Cable Whitfield's ledger, from Clary, one-child girl, born March. Estimated value at age 10, $400, to the financial architecture of the United States in the 21st century. The line is not straight, it is not simple, and it is not the only line that matters. But it exists. It runs through Reconstruction and its violent suppression, through the convict leasing system that re-enslaved black men under the cover of the criminal justice system, through the legal structures that prevented black Americans from accumulating the wealth that was being accumulated by white Americans, through mechanisms that directly descended from the structures that had been built on slavery. It runs through redlining and exclusion from the GI Bill and the systematic underappraisal of black-owned property. It runs to the present day. This is not an argument about guilt. It is an argument about structure. It is an argument that the wealth created by 250 years of slavery and 57 years of domestic slave breeding did not evaporate. It became something else, and the poverty, the family instability, the structural disadvantage that is the inheritance of the people who were bred and sold, that did not evaporate either. It also became something else. And what it became has been blamed, for 160 years, on the people to whom it happened. The systematic destruction of black families through sale and separation, children taken from mothers, husbands separated from wives, parents sold away from children, was not an accidental byproduct of the slave system. It was a feature of it. It was, in the specific context of the breeding trade, an intentional product. Children were born to be sold. The separation was built into the business model. And then, when the system that produced the separation was ended, when the legal apparatus of slavery was dismantled, the separated families were left to reassemble themselves from nothing in a social and economic environment designed to prevent their reassembly. Formerly enslaved people in the years after emancipation spent tremendous energy and resources searching for family members sold away, running advertisements in black newspapers, walking hundreds of miles, writing letters in the new literacy that freedom had made possible. Many found no one. Many found graves. The searches are documented, and they are devastating, and they are the evidence of what was destroyed, not just the people who were sold, but the knowledge of where they had gone, the family memory that the sale records replaced with columns of prices. And for 160 years since emancipation, the black family instability that was produced by 250 years of deliberate family destruction has been cited by politicians and pundits and social commentators as evidence of a cultural pathology, as though the pathology belonged to the families rather than to the system, as though the disruption were chosen rather than engineered, as though the man who wrote, "All men are created equal," bears no responsibility for the $400 next to a 6-week-old girl's name in his ideological descendants' ledger. This is what Phoebe knew, counting to 11 in the dark. This is what Clary knew, memorizing faces. This is what the WPA narrators knew, speaking in the 1930s to strangers with notebooks, knowing that their testimony might be the last chance to put the truth on record, that the disruption had a cause, that the cause had names and prices and shipping manifests, and that the pretense that it did not was the final theft, the theft of the explanation. Franklin and Armfield's operation at 1315 Duke Street in Alexandria had closed by the late 1840s, the partners having retired with their considerable fortunes. Isaac Franklin, who had personally supervised the transport of tens of thousands of enslaved people from the Alexandria depot to the New Orleans market, died in 1846 at Fairview, his Tennessee plantation, surrounded by the pleasures of a wealthy man's retirement. Horses guests, the company of his wife. His obituaries described him as a prominent citizen. The word slave trader appeared in none of them. John Armfield retired to his North Carolina estate, became involved in civic life, made philanthropic donations, became in the course of time a respected elder of his community. He died in 1871, 6 years after the war ended. He had lived to see the legal end of the institution that had made him wealthy, and he had survived it, and his wealth had survived it, and his community had not required him to account for how the wealth had been made. The building at 1315 Duke Street in Alexandria still stands. For many decades after the trade ended, it was used for various commercial purposes, its history obscured by the ordinary passage of time and the ordinary human preference for not looking too directly at certain kinds of evidence. In the late 20th century, it became the Freedom House Museum, dedicated to the history of the domestic slave trade. It is the only institution of its kind in the country that occupies the physical site of a major slave trading operation. You can stand in the rooms where enslaved people were held before being shipped south. You can read the records. The building remembers what the neighborhood brochures do not. It is not alone in this kind of remembering. The Jefferson Memorial, on the banks of the tidal basin in Washington, is inscribed with words from the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence and calculated the 4% yield on his enslaved women's reproductive capacity. His farm book, which records the births and deaths and sales of the people he owned, is in the Library of Congress. Both documents are available to the public. They have always been available. It is a matter of what you are willing to look at when you stand in the marble and the light. The plantation ledgers of Henrico County, Virginia, including possibly the ledger that opened this story, are in the archives of the Virginia Historical Society and the Library of Virginia. The sale records and deed books that document the transactions are in county courthouses. The shipping manifests of the New Orleans Custom House are in the National Archives. The WPA slave narratives are in the Library of Congress, digitized and searchable. The newspaper advertisements, for sale, a likely Negro woman, age 22, a good breeder, guaranteed sound, are in the microfilm collections of university libraries. The records exist. They were kept by the people who ran the system, because the system was a business, and businesses keep records. The records were not hidden. They were not destroyed. They were simply not read, not cited, not integrated into the version of American history that was taught in schools and celebrated in monuments, and encoded in the national self-image. The choice to not read them has been, like so many choices in this history, a choice with beneficiaries and a choice with victims. The land itself is another kind of record. In the Virginia countryside where Clary and Phoebe and Wash and Siller lived, where the tobacco fields gave way to the breeding farms, and the breeding farms eventually gave way to the chaos and terror of war, and then to the long, incomplete reckoning of its aftermath. The land has been rearranged. The plantation houses that survive, and many survive because they were built to last, built of good Virginia brick, built with the proceeds of generations of human trafficking, are now listed on the Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register of Historic Places. They are photographed by tourists. They are rented for weddings. Couples dance on ground where children were sold from their mothers. The catering tables are set up in the shadows of the houses where the ledgers were kept. The flowers grow well in this soil. The soil is very rich, amended over generations by the labor of people who were not permitted to own it, tended by hands that were themselves listed in a column next to the corn. Some of the old plantation properties have historic markers that mention the enslaved people who lived and worked here. The markers are small, typically, and positioned where they will be seen if you are looking for them. The main house, the gardens, the columned portico, these are photographed. The quarters, where they have not been demolished, are less photographed. The graves are often unmarked. The records of who is buried where are often incomplete or non-existent, because the same accounting system that tracked births and sales and prices did not always track deaths, particularly not of children, particularly not in the years of cholera and dysentery and the other diseases that moved through enslaved quarters with a specific and terrible efficiency. The descendants of the people who lived on these properties have, in some cases, been able to trace their ancestry through the sale records and deed books to find, in the columns of the ledgers, the names and ages and prices that constitute the documentary trace of their great-great-grandparents. It is a strange and painful form of genealogy, reading your family history in the language of commercial accounting, but it is sometimes the only genealogy available. The records that exist were kept for the purposes of the system, in the language of the system, and they must be read against their grain to yield the human information they contain. A woman named Margaret from Mississippi, interviewed by a WPA worker in 1937, described searching for her mother after emancipation. She had been sold away from her mother when she was 9 years old and had not seen her in 40 years. After the war, she found a man who had known her mother, who told her that her mother had died in 1869, 4 years after the war ended, in the same county where she had lived for her entire life after the sale. She had been free for 4 years when she died. She had spent those 4 years working as a sharecropper on land not far from where she had been enslaved, because she had nowhere else to go, and no resources with which to go elsewhere. Margaret did not learn where her mother was buried. The land had changed hands. There was no marker. She went to the area and walked the fields for 2 days, looking for some sign, some unevenness in the ground, some place where the soil had been turned. She found nothing she could be sure of. "But I figured she was there somewhere," Margaret told the interviewer. "Somewhere in that ground. I talked to the ground. I said, 'Mama, it's me.' I said, 'I looked for you.' I said, 'I remembered the count.'" The count. The number of children. The inventory of a life that the system had tried to reduce to a price in a column. The thing that Phoebe had taught Clary, that Clary had taught Siller, that had traveled south on the coffle and survived the auction block and the cotton field and the 40 years of waiting, and arrived finally in a Mississippi field where a woman in her 50s stood in the dirt and told the ground that she remembered. The ground remembered too. The ground always remembers. It is only the people who stand on the ground, who build their houses on it, and their economies on it, and their national myths on it, who have difficulty with memory. Let us be precise about what is being described. The domestic slave breeding industry of the United States operated continuously from approximately 1808, when the Atlantic trade was banned, until 1865, when the 13th Amendment ended legal slavery. That is 57 years. 57 years in which the explicit, documented, commercially organized practice of breeding human beings for sale was a central feature of the American economy. 57 years of ledger entries. 57 years of Dr. Farrow's examinations and Josiah Peck's notebooks and Cable Whitfield's calculations. 57 years of coffles moving south through the Virginia countryside, of ships leaving Alexandria for New Orleans, of auction blocks in the St. Charles Hotel and on Magazine Street. 57 years of Phoebe counting. In those 57 years, approximately 1 million people were moved from the Upper South to the Deep South. In those 57 years, the American cotton economy grew from 73,000 bales per year to 4.5 million bales per year. In those 57 years, the market value of enslaved human beings grew to $3.5 billion, larger than every railroad, factory, and bank in the country combined. In those 57 years, the United States became the world's dominant cotton producer, and cotton became the foundation of the industrial textile economy of New England and Britain, which meant that the enslavement and breeding of human beings in Virginia and Maryland and Kentucky was not only a Southern story, or even an American story, but a story about the financial infrastructure of the entire industrializing world. Edward Baptist, in his 2014 history, "The Half Has Never Been Told," makes the argument explicitly. Slavery was not a pre-modern holdover, a remnant of a feudal past that the modern American economy would have naturally outgrown. It was a cutting-edge capitalist enterprise, using the most sophisticated financial instruments of its time: commodity futures, insurance contracts, mortgage-backed securities with enslaved people as collateral, to drive growth. The planters who bred and sold human beings were not backward traditionalists clinging to an old way of life. They were innovators in a system of capital accumulation that fed directly into the industrial economy of the 19th century. This matters because the story of slavery as a pre-modern holdover implies that it would have ended on its own, eventually, and that the wealth it generated was somehow separate from the modern American economy. Neither is true. The wealth generated by slavery flowed directly into the industrial economy. The banks and insurance companies that financed and insured the slave trade are in many cases the direct institutional ancestors of institutions that are still operating. The wealth did not stop at emancipation. It transformed. And the system that was used to generate that wealth, the system of extraction, the system of treating human beings as productive assets to be optimized for maximum return, the system of separating families and suppressing testimony and erasing history, left a legacy that is not merely historical. It is present. It is visible in the structure of American cities and the distribution of American wealth and the operation of American institutions. It is visible in every attempt to discuss it honestly and the resistance that attempt encounters. There are plantation houses in Virginia and Maryland and Kentucky that are now bed and breakfasts. They advertise their history on their websites, the old brickwork, the original fireplaces, the restored gardens, the beautiful views of the countryside. Some of them mention the enslaved people who built and maintained them. Some of them do not. Some of the ones that mention the enslaved people do so in the language of the people who lived and worked here, a phrase that achieves the grammatical structure of acknowledgement while carefully evacuating its content, because lived and worked is true in the way that the Holocaust was a difficult period in European history is true, accurate in its individual components and catastrophically wrong in what it leaves out. The breeding farms are among those properties. The plantations that shifted from tobacco to people, that appear in the ledgers not as agricultural enterprises but as human production facilities, are the same plantations that appear in the tourism literature as examples of antebellum heritage, of Virginia's gracious past, of the architecture and landscape of the Old South. The language of heritage tourism and the language of the ledger coexist in the same geographical space, and one of them is considerably louder than the other. There are people in the United States today who can trace their ancestry to a sale record, who know that their great-great-grandmother appears in a Virginia ledger with a price next to her name, who know that their great-great-great-grandmother was listed in that same ledger in the right-hand column, the column next to the corn. These people exist. They are the descendants of the people in this story, of Clary and Phoebe and Siller and Wash and the 3-year-old on the manifest named Harriet and the nameless woman from Virginia interviewed in 1937 who said she didn't know which hurt worse, the ones that died or the ones that got sold. They are also the people who have been told for 160 years that the family instability created by the systematic destruction of their families over 250 years is evidence of their own cultural failure. The circularity of that argument, create the problem by design, then blame the victims of the problem for the problem, is so complete that it has been invisible to most of the people who have benefited from it. Or perhaps not invisible, perhaps simply useful. Wash was sold in 1847, 7 years after Siller was taken. He went to a buyer in Tennessee, a farm that needed a blacksmith, or claimed to need a blacksmith. What it may actually have needed, given the price paid and the notation in the sale record about his physical characteristics, is the same thing the other 2 plantations he had been hired out to had needed. He did not say goodbye to Clary because he was not given the opportunity. He went with 2 days' notice, which is to say he went immediately, as immediacy was defined in a world where 2 days was the most warning you could expect, and was in fact more than many people received. Clary did not say anything about it for several days. Thomas was 12 years old, and watched his mother in the way that children watch their parents when something has happened that the parents are not talking about, with a sidelong, quiet attention, ready to be needed and trying to be invisible at the same time. Phoebe cooked. Clary worked. The forge was cold. On the third evening, Clary sat down next to Phoebe and put her hands flat on the table between them. "How many?" she asked. Phoebe knew what she meant. She had always known what the question meant, because she had asked it herself, had asked it in her own way for 40 years. 11, Phoebe said. Her voice was steady. 7 alive. 4 here. And yours, Thomas here, and Siller south somewhere, and the others where they went. And Wash's, on the farms he was hired to, on the Tennessee farm now. Yes. How many is that total? Phoebe thought about it. She was counting in her head. The real count. The full count. The one that included everyone who had passed through this plantation system of increase and been split off in the various directions that the market had sent them. I stopped being able to count them all, Phoebe said finally. There's too many now. That's what they counted on. Make so many of us, sell so many of us, that we can't even hold the count of all of us anymore. She looked at her hands. But we hold what we can. We hold what we know. Clary nodded. She was 38 years old. Thomas was 12. The war that would end this was 18 years away, and neither of them knew it was coming. And even if they had known, they could not have calculated what would survive it, and what would not. What Clary knew, sitting at the table with her mother in the evening of 1847, was the count. The specific, preserved, deliberately maintained inventory of the people she had loved and lost and memorized and kept in the interior space that the system could not reach, no matter what it took from her. She knew the sound of Siller's breathing. She knew the weight of the Georgia girl in her arms. She knew Amos's face. She knew Wash's voice, the particular quality of his silence, the way he sat with truth instead of hiding from it. She kept the count. This was not nothing. In a system designed to reduce human beings to entries in a ledger, to strip them of the relational ties that constitute a self, to make them purely productive in a way that required their humanity to be invisible. In that system, keeping the count was an act of profound and deliberate defiance. It was the insistence that the people in the right-hand column were people in the left-hand column, too. Were, in fact, people period. Were people whose births and faces and voices and specific ways of moving through the world mattered not because they could be converted into cash, but because they were themselves, which was enough, which was everything, which was the thing the ledger could not contain, no matter how carefully Whitfield filled it in. Phoebe had known this for 40 years. She had passed it to Clary. Clary had passed it to Siller, there on the morning when the coffle came, when the count was the only thing left to give. The country that sold Siller for $560 and put her on a chain south has spent a century and a half constructing a version of itself in which this transaction was a regrettable footnote rather than a defining feature, in which the 57 years of domestic slave breeding were a sideshow rather than a central industry, in which the $3.5 billion in human capital that constituted the largest asset class in the American economy in 1860 disappeared at Appomattox, rather than transforming into the next form of accumulated advantage, in which Phoebe's 11 children and Clary's count are personal tragedies, rather than the designed output of a system that also designed the conditions in which their descendants would live for the next 160 years. The ledger page from 1840 is still there. The right-hand column is still readable. Clary, one-child girl, born March. Estimated value at age 10, $400. On the left, the corn. On the right, the child. Both columns are true. Both columns need to be read. The difficulty, the specific, chosen, sustained difficulty, has always been reading them simultaneously, holding both in view at once, understanding that the same economy, the same nation, the same set of human decisions produced both, that the corn and the child were in the same ledger, under the same name, kept by the same careful hand, because they were both, in the logic of that ledger, things that could be planted and harvested and sold. The ledger is in an archive now. The soil of the plantation where it was kept is probably someone's garden or vineyard or wedding venue. The house is probably still there. Good Virginia brick lasts. The graves of the people in the right-hand column are probably not marked. A woman was interviewed in Henrico County, Virginia, in 1937. She was 91 years old. She had been enslaved on a plantation in the county until she was 20 years old, when the war ended. Her name, according to the interview record, was Clara. Whether this was a different woman from the one in Whitfield's ledger, whether it was Clary herself grown old in the place she had spent her life, whether it was one of Clary's descendants carrying a version of the same name, the archive does not say. The archive has its limits, as all human records do. But the woman called Clara said this near the end of the interview, when the federal writer asked her if there was anything else she wanted people to know. "I want them to know we remembered. Every one of us that got taken, we remembered them. We held them. They couldn't take the memory away from us, no matter what else they took. And I want whoever comes after to know that. I want them to know the count." The count, 11, 7 alive, 4 here and yours, and the ones on the farms he was hired to, and the one in Alabama, and the one in Louisiana, about whom there was only silence, which was itself a form of information. And Siller, 14 years old, $560, sound and likely, marching south in the September of 1840, with her shoulder level and her mother's voice burning in her memory, like a lamp flame she was praying would last. And the 3-year-old on the manifest, named Harriet, 36 inches, $120. And the girl from Georgia, who was 7 when she was sold, and whose name this narrative does not know, because the record that would have held it was not kept in the place where Clary could find it. And Amos, 4 years old, whose face Clary had pressed into her palms and tried to keep. The count. What do you call a country that bred human beings for profit for 57 years after banning the slave trade, that moved 1 million people internally in chains, that accumulated $3.5 billion in human capital and built its industrial economy on that foundation, and then spent 160 years constructing an official story in which none of this was the main character? You call it what it is. You call it by name. You read both columns. You hold the count. The ledger is still there. The ink has faded to brown at the edges where the humidity has worked on it for nearly 2 centuries. But the handwriting is clear. The columns are legible. Left column, corn, rye, sweet potatoes. Right column, Clary. Child, March, $400. The record exists. It has always existed. Now you know it. Now you keep it.